Today I'm going to talk about lags in the response of ecosystems to changes in precipitation. And I encourage all of you to interrupt me as things are not clear. And if I'm talking about things that you already know, you just need to roll your eyes and I'll speed up my So the topic of today's talk is lags in the response of ecosystems to changes in precipitation. And I'll start with something that from a long time ago we've known that there is a strong relationship between primary production and mean annual precipitation. And this has been established for a lot of places. Here is a study in the US based on around 1,000 data points, where each data point is the mean annual precipitation. In the y-axis you have the mean annual production. So the wetter, the higher the production. It's a very simple model. There's similar examples of papers from China and for Africa. So these are not nothing is new here. I think I want to highlight here, we are explaining with mean annual precipitation around 94% of the variability in production. So the basic message at this point was that a very, very simple model accounts for a large fraction of the variability of above ground net primary production across space for most grasslands of the world. So I could retire now, but what happened is that then this is the same model that from now on I'm going to call this spatial model. This is how changes in mean annual precipitation affect mean annual production. And then we found a data set for what they were for a single location. We found 54 years of data. And this is the temporal model. This is the blue line. So, and you see, in this case, this model is made out of the precipitation of each year and the production of each year. And of course, it's not that the system became wetter or went drier, but there were dry, wet years. And so the next message is that we try to collect data from a lot of different parts of the world. And so the message that I get from comparing these two curves is that the spatial models and the temporal models are quite different. So we thought that the next step was trying to look this at a global scale. So we embarked in trying to find data sets all over the world that had more than 10 years of primary production data. And we found all these estimates from all over the world with the gaps that are pretty obvious. And this is the sum of all this. And again, what we have here is precipitation. What we have here is production. The color lines represent the spatial models. So this is the relationship between changes in mean annual precipitation and changes in mean annual production. And all these dotted lines are the temporal models for all these different regions. So that tells you the very strong difference is that the slope is much shallower through time than space. And you'll see that also the temporal models explain much less than the spatial models. And this is sort of a key point that I'm going to, because the rest of the talk is going to hinge in comparing the temporal and the spatial models. So the message now is that this apparently is suggesting that time and space cannot be exchanged for the relationship between primary production and precipitation. So these beautiful spatial models that we had that fit all across the grasslands all over the world do not fit, cannot allow us to predict the response through time. So my second bullet is spatial model does not work through time. The temporal model only accounts for a small fraction of the variability explained by the spatial models. So remember, the spatial models were in the 90s. The temporal models are 20%, 17%, that order, and have a much shallower slope. So we have a hypothesis of why this is the case. In our hypothesis is that the differences between the spatial and the temporal models are explained by time lags in the ecosystem response to changes in water availability. And so now let me have two slides about what I mean by legacies and lags in the response. So time lags result from legacies of wet and dry years. So what happens in 2015 has a lot to do with the climatic conditions in 2015, plus the previous history of what happened in 2014, what happened in 2013, and that varies if the previous years were wet years or dry years. So we have a productivity that we observe in 2015, and we say that it's a function of two things: the precipitation in our year 2015 and the legacy, what happened before. And we reverse the terms, and it says that the legacies is the difference between the production that we observe and the production that we expected based on this long-term relationship between production and precipitation. And also, the magnitude of that legacy, we hypothesize, is a function of the difference between the precipitation in this current year and the previous year. So to the point that if the 2 years had the same precipitation, the legacy is equal to 0, and then legacy disappears here, and the production is equal to the long-term production of the site. Correct? My second one is that this is repeating the first one, so there's a hook. So this magnitude of the legacy is a function of the difference in precipitation between current year and previous year. But also, there's no reason to think that the shape of that relationship of the legacy with the difference needs to be linear. Could be curvilinear, could have multiple. So my last question is, how does this relationship change across the precipitation gradient? Is there a pie for ecology for the relationship between what happened in the previous year to what happens this year? And so this is a good time to ask questions, because from now on we launch into, so here we are, which have 3 slides of some hypotheses. And I want to walk you through this axis that seem to be need a little bit of attention. So what we have here is the difference in precipitation between the previous year and the current year. So 0 means that last year rained the same as this year, correct? And a negative value means a dry preceding, that the previous year was drier than the current year, and this is a wet preceding. And what we have here is a legacy. Is the productivity observed minus the productivity expected. So if the 2 years had the same, the legacy is equal to 0. And here we have 4 hypotheses about the relationship between the difference between current and previous year precipitation and the shape of the legacy. The simplest one is H1, means that a previous year being dry reduced current year production, a previous year being wet has increased production higher than you would expect based on current year. Yes?
Which crop are you referring to, the yields?
Ecosystems. Ecosystems. Multi-species natural grasslands.
Only grassland, no crops?
No crops.
No crops?
No.
There's nothing to do with agriculture?
No, but it's a good segue in agriculture, and then because when I end up telling the story, you're going to see that, and then I'm blowing my punchline, but it's a little bit with the structure of the ecosystem. And what happens with agriculture is that humans control the structure. Humans control the density, the number of seeds you plant of wheat per meter square. So we'll get there. But please keep that. I'll promise I'll come back. This is all grasslands. So this is the H1. The H2 is the opposite, just for completion, that you have the previous year enhanced production. If your previous year was dry, production is higher than you would expect it. And the only explanation that you can think about is excess, for example, herbivory. If the previous year was very dry, the native herbivores are depleted, and therefore you have a higher production than you would expect it. The most interesting one for me is H3. And this involves a little bit of evolutionary thinking, because it has to do with the forces that drive the deployment of new tissues versus the forces that the forest plans to upsize tissues. So as the year becomes wetter, plants respond by deploying new roots, new leaves, new twigs. Okay, so more. But once so there are cues that trigger the deployment of new organs. Follow me that. So that would be sort of this straight line. But then when the system goes from dry to wet. But when it goes from wet to dry, it's the opposite, because the structures are there. So plants have already invested carbon nutrients into this structure. So they are not ready to upsize those structures right away. So that may give this interesting asymmetry between the response to. So those are my basic hypotheses. The H4 is one that is a hump shape that hinges on the optimal because of the high respiration cost of a lot of the structures. Yes?
As you are trying to predict an hypothesis, wouldn't it be much better to have average of previous years and not only previous year?
Instead of using previous year, you can use T minus 2, T minus 3, T minus 4. Is that what you're saying?
An average of the 5 previous years.
Instead of looking at T minus 1, you're saying the average of the several years? Yes, absolutely. You can do that. There are two constraints. First of all, experimentally, it's much more difficult. It's easy to have a previous dry year, previous wet year. I'll show you. And also, it's very difficult to find time series where you have the previous 5 years were wet, the previous 5 years were dry. Most of the time, you have a lot of variability. So I think theoretically, you are absolutely correct. We can have a hypothesis with the average. And also, it would be nice to have hypothesis and play with that window. So you have a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, 5 years. And I've done that with a model that I'm not presenting here. But I've sort of played with that window, but with a modeling. And it's experimentally or with data analysis is difficult to do. So these are my basic hypotheses. These are the same hypotheses seen in a simpler way. This is H1. So this is the long-term relationship between production and precipitation. And this is a system that goes from a dry year into a wet year. You see that the production is less than. And here, if it comes from a wet to dry, the production is higher than you would expect it. And in this case, the absolute value of A is equal to the absolute value of B. This is H1, this is H2, and this is the nice one, the asymmetric one, that when it comes from wet to dry, the gap is much larger than when it comes from dry to wet. Correct? So we use all these data sets and look, and this is sort of a key figure. What we have here is the standardized productions for all the sites, and this is the distribution of all the sites, all the years, and this is the distribution for all the sites that had, in the previous year, they had dry conditions or conditions of low primary production. So this is the test showing that there is a legacy effect. You see that the mean is moved to the left. So those sites that had dry conditions or low productivity conditions the previous year had on average a lower production. And here is the standardized precipitation. and this is standardized production. I mean, it's standardized because we have wet systems, dry systems, all mixed together. So this is nothing new for you. We're seeing a relationship. But when we look at the residuals, you see that part of the residuals of that previous is accounted for by the precipitation in the previous year. And so this is showing that this issue of the legacies, it seems to be a generalized phenomenon of all grasslands all over the world. And the correlation is even stronger when you look at what happened, the production in the previous year. And going back to your question, I think it would have been impossible to do that with this data set with more than 1 year. We can do it with models. And then if you imagine our linear model that we were using, you see that the value of precipitation, the precipitation of the current year, the effect on primary production, the partial coefficient, the beta 1 is the coefficient of this linear model, decreases with mean annual precipitation. What I think it makes sense, the precipitation becomes less important as the systems become wetter and wetter, and other factors besides water become more important. We didn't find a significant relationship with it. In all cases, the previous year was important, but it didn't change with mean annual precipitation. So this is our approach using somebody else's data. Then we did some experiments in a desert grassland that looks like this, and in a place that ranges around 240 millimeters in southern New Mexico in the US. And this is the long-term precipitation record. And so we have some treatments in which we enhance precipitation by 50%, enhance precipitation by 80%, and other treatments where we reduce precipitation by 50% and reduce by 80%. Okay? Drought, extreme drought controls, extreme wet conditions, and extreme wet. After 2 years, we flip to create extreme legacies and be able to test the legacies experimentally. So all the ones that have drought became wet, all that were wet became drought. And we did that with a combination of these rainout shelters that intercepted 50 or 80% of the incoming precipitation. And we also used some irrigation. Part of the water runs off into the other plots. So this is a very highly replicated system. We have in order of 132 plots. And so here's the ultimate proof. So this is the delta precipitation. This is the change in precipitation between the current year and previous year as we manipulated, and it ranges. And this is the value of legacies that by now all of you are familiar with. So the larger the delta, the higher the value of the legacies. And this is the model here. So we test our first hypothesis that we saw it with this large data set. Now we test it experimentally. The difference between the data sets and the experiments that led us to assess cause-effect relationships. That the correlation we couldn't do with the correlative approach. And we did the same thing in another grassland in Patagonia, and I'm going to skip this. And so the conclusion of this section is that changes in precipitation result in legacies. The magnitude of the legacy is a function of the difference in precipitation of current year and previous year. And the legacies in the Chihuahuan Desert in this particular ecosystem are symmetrical. By that it means that the positive absolute value of the positive legacy is equal to the positive value of the negative legacy. We don't know if that's true everywhere, but that's in our experimental system. And a corollary of this is that the positive legacies would compensate negative legacies. And under scenario of increased precipitation variability, the mean will not be affected. Though you are all familiar with this idea that climate change will bring not only changes in the mean conditions, warmer, drier, wetter, but also changes in the variance. So these results sort of point out that the increases in the variance, since the positive legacies are going to be equal to the negative legacies, one is going to offset the other. So increase in variance, according to these results, do not affect the mean. So now the last part of the talk is to discuss what are the hypotheses. Why do these legacies occur? And here is where the crops come. So there are structural mechanisms, biogeochemical mechanisms, and soil moisture carryover. The structural mechanisms is that meristem density constrains production response to wet year after a dry year. So if a very dry year kills a lot of individuals, kills a lot of meristems, and therefore if that dry year is followed by a wet year, there are not enough plants, there are not enough twigs, there are not enough roots to take advantage of all those resources. That is in the biogeochemical limitation is that it's not all about a structure, it's about nitrogen limitation, constraining production response to a wet year. So assume that most of the nitrogen that is available for the ecosystem in 1 year depended on the input in the previous year. So if the previous year was very dry, there was very little input into the soil, and therefore there was going to be limited by nitrogen. And the third mechanism is the soil moisture carryover. And this is the link with production, because what happened if, according to these two mechanisms, humans manipulate those two. Humans control the density of the crop, we control nitrogen fertilization, and so it would be a nice comparison. But so now the first results are supporting the idea of the structural hypothesis, the structural mechanism. And here what we have is changes in tiller density at the tiller density at the beginning of the growing season and the magnitude of the legacy. So you see that there's a relationship between number of tillers at the beginning and the magnitude of the legacy. And the next one is the relation between precipitation and number of tillers at the beginning of the growing season. So what happens is a very dry year constrains the number of tillers, and therefore, you know what tillers are? Little branches of grasses. So constrains the number of tillers, the density of tillers constrains the ability of the ecosystem to take advantage of the abundant resources of a wet year. And the same thing happens when a very wet year, there's excess structures that fully take advantage of the resources. We look at different components of structure, tiller density, stolons, different plants have different reproductive organs, and we found that a relationship between precipitation and tiller density, stolon density, and total buds per tiller, but very little with other forms of the structure. So the parts of these reproductive structures are very flexible, some of them are very rigid. And now we go to the biogeochemical mechanism, and what we found is, this is a repeat for, remember, to refresh you, this is a relation between the difference in precipitation between current year and previous year precipitation, and this is the magnitude of the legacy. And this is the relationship between soil inorganic nitrogen and the magnitude of the legacy. No effect. So far, what we've shown is that there are the structural mechanism, the hypothesis of the structural mechanism is being supported, the biogeochemical mechanism seems to be rejected. And that is a result of, it's not because, so we did that treatment of water, but we crossed it with a fertilization treatment. So we have previous year precipitation in soil nitrogen in the unfertilized, in the fertilized. So you see the quite different order of magnitude for the axis for the fertilized in the non-fertilized. So it's not that we put the nitrogen got there, the soil become richer, but it didn't affect the magnitude of the legacies, correct? And what happened is that there was no relationship between the amount of precipitation and the rate of net nitrogen mineralization. This is the production of mineral nitrogen out of organic nitrogen. That process seems to be completely insensitive to water. So wet years, dry years that we manipulated all produce the same amount of inorganic nitrogen. So so here we have the two panels for grasses, and this is the two bottom panels for shrubs. Focus on the grasses first. What we have here is the nitrogen uptake. And you see that there is, as precipitation increases the uptake from plants, from grasses. And this is the leaf nitrogen concentration. It declines, so it grows. When the year is wet, plants grow really fast, and they're absorbing much more nitrogen from the soil, even diluting the nitrogen in the leaves, correct? So if think about that, the production of nitrogen remains constant, the previous slide. In this slide, I'm showing you that plants respond to water, and they grow faster. They absorb more nitrogen from the soil, and as a consequence of that, what happened is that the nitrate stocks decline with water availability. So the drier the soil, the higher the concentration of nitrates. And why? Because the production stays constant and the absorption by plants is constrained by water. And we see that these are for fertilized and unfertilized. This is for ammonium. This is for nitrate. This ammonium is less sensitive, and this is the ratio between nitrate and ammonium. So if this didn't change, you see that there is a relatively high nitrate to ammonium ratio in the very dry end of our treatments. Got it. The soil moisture carryover to depth, we didn't find any effect of the previous year treatment on, so all the water is used, so there was no water carryover. And the conclusions is that tiller density determines the magnitude of the legacies. The biogeochemical mechanisms do not determine the legacies, and soil water carryover does not determine the legacies. And so I'll stop here, and I have a few minutes for questions. Do I?